Montana winter held the valley in its frozen grip as an old man settled into his chair beside the crackling fire. At 84, Caleb Thorne's hands trembled with age, but his eyes remained sharp as a hawk, sighting prey across morning snow. The year was 1953, and outside his cabin window, fresh powder covered the Bitterroot Valley exactly as it had 70 years before. Across from him sat his grandson, Ethan, 18 years old in his army dress shirt 3 days from shipping out to Korea. The boy's face carried that particular blend of courage and terror that Caleb recognized from a different war, a different century when young men learned what their souls were made of. "You scared of dying?" Caleb's voice came out gravelly, worn smooth by decades. Ethan met his grandfather's gaze and answered with the honesty of youth not yet corrupted by pride. "Yes, sir, I am." "Good," Caleb nodded slowly. "Fear keeps a man alive. But there's something more important than staying alive." He paused, letting the fire pop and hiss. "February of 1883, when I was 34 years old, about your father's age now, I learned that lesson. And it shaped every day I've lived since." The young man leaned forward, sensing the weight behind those words. "What happened, Grandpa?" Caleb turned his face toward the window where snowflakes drifted past in the darkness, each one catching lamplight like tiny stars falling to earth. His mind traveled back across 7 decades to when his beard had been black instead of white, when his hands had been steady enough to thread a needle or pull a trigger without hesitation. "I found a nun dying in the snow," he said quietly, "and I decided to stop running." The fire crackled, wind moaned against the cabin walls, and Caleb began to speak of a winter that had changed everything. The Bitterroot Valley stretched beneath a dying winter sun as Caleb Thorne rode his horse along the frozen trail in February of 1883. Mountains rose like jagged teeth against the western sky, their peaks already swallowed by approaching darkness. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon, and now the cold bit through his leather coat like a hungry animal searching for warmth. At 34, Caleb carried the weathered look of a man who had survived things that killed softer men. His beard grew thick and black across a face tanned dark by sun and wind. A scar ran down his left cheek, legacy of a knife fight in a Missoula bar 3 years back. His Colt Peacemaker hung heavy against his right thigh, 6 rounds, waiting in the cylinder like sleeping wolves. He had not fired that weapon at another man since leaving Kansas, since watching his brother bleed out on a saloon floor, while the man who killed him walked free. That memory still burned like a brand pressed against his skull. In the voice of the old man telling the story 70 years later, there came a pause, heavy with grief that time had not erased. "My brother Danny was 19 when he died. Quick smile, quicker mind, future bright as polished silver. Some hired gun accused him of cheating at a poker game Danny wasn't even playing. When Danny denied it when he drew his pistol, because pride demanded a response, that killer put 3 rounds in his chest before Danny's gun cleared leather. The young Caleb had arrived 5 minutes too late. He found Danny on the sawdust floor, eyes already glazing, hands still reaching for a weapon that had done him no good. Caleb held his baby brother while the light faded, felt the last breath leave his body, watched death steal someone he had sworn to protect. 1 week later, Caleb found the hired gun outside a brothel at the edge of Abilene. No challenge, no warning, just 3 bullets placed center mass before the man could reach for his weapon. Then Caleb rode to the wealthy rancher's property under cover of darkness and burned the stables, burned the barn, burned everything that would catch flame. Then he ran. Wanted posters followed him across state lines. Murder and arson. $500 for Caleb Thorne, dead or alive. He had been running ever since, living in the high country like a ghost, trapping beaver and mink, selling pelts twice a year in towns where nobody looked too closely at a man's face. "Some wounds never heal," the old Caleb's voice whispered across the decades. "They just stop bleeding long enough for a man to pretend he's whole again." The young Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead as his horse's hooves crunched through crusted snow. His cabin waited 3 miles north, promising warmth and solitude. Those were the only things he wanted anymore. No conversations, no connections, no reasons for anyone to remember his face or whisper his name in crowded rooms. Then something at the edge of his vision made him pull the reins. St. Mary's Orphanage sat near the valley's eastern boundary, a small structure built from pine logs and stubborn determination. Smoke should have been rising from its stone chimney. Every cabin in Montana Territory showed smoke this time of year. Fire meant life. Fire meant survival. But the orphanage chimney stood cold and empty against the darkening sky. Caleb stared at that silent building while his horse stamped impatiently beneath him. His gut tightened with a familiar dread. In weather like this, no smoke meant only two possibilities. Either the cabin stood abandoned, or someone inside had stopped being able to feed the flames. The old man's voice came soft through the story, carrying wisdom earned through hard years. I knew what no smoke meant, knew it in my bones. But part of me wanted to keep riding, wanted to let someone else find whatever tragedy waited in that building. Because I was wanted, because I was afraid, because getting involved with people meant getting caught. But Caleb thought of Danny dying alone on that saloon floor, thought of arriving 5 minutes too late, and he turned his horse toward the orphanage. The closer he rode, the worse the feeling in his chest became. No lantern glow flickered behind the frosted windows. No sound of movement drifted across the frozen air. The cabin sat dark and silent as a fresh grave. St. Mary's had been built 3 years earlier by Father Thomas Hartley, a blacksmith who had found God somewhere between shaping horseshoes and burying his Apache wife. He had purchased 160 acres with honest money, erected this orphanage with his own hands, and filled it with children nobody else wanted. Children from mining camps where mothers died in childbirth and fathers drank themselves to death. Children with mixed blood who belonged nowhere in the white man's world. Thomas had been murdered 14 months ago in what the sheriff called a fair duel. Nobody who witnessed it believed that lie, but nobody possessed the courage to say otherwise. Caleb dismounted at the fence post and looped his reins around weathered wood. The porch boards groaned beneath his boots as he approached the door. He knocked once with a gloved fist. The sound echoed across the empty yard and faded into nothing. No answer came. He pushed the door open slowly, keeping his right hand near the colt. Darkness greeted him, thick and cold. The temperature inside felt worse than the air outside, which meant the fire had been dead for hours. Gray ash filled the stone hearth where flames should have danced. The cabin smelled of cold wood and something else. Something that reminded him of winter battlefields where wounded men froze before help could reach them. Then he saw them. 12 children huddled beneath blankets in the corner, alive, but shivering so violently their teeth clacked together like dice in a gambler's hand. Their faces were pale as candle wax lips tinged blue at the edges. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 14, looked up at him with eyes that had already seen too much suffering. "Sister Mary," the girl whispered through chattering teeth. "She won't wake up." Caleb crossed to the small room at the back. In a narrow cell barely large enough for a bed and a wooden trunk, he found Sister Mary Catherine. She lay sprawled on the floor where she had collapsed, her nun's habit soaked through with melted snow and ice water. Her skin had turned the blue-gray color that preceded death, and her lips were purple as bruised plums. Each breath came as a shallow gasp, 43 per minute by Caleb's count. Too fast, her body fighting desperately against the cold that was claiming her inch by inch. Hypothermia, the silent killer that crept through wet fabric and stole heat until the heart simply forgot how to beat. The old man's voice carried the weight of memory. I had seen this before. During my cavalry years, men caught in blizzards turned up hours later with frost coating their eyelashes and ice forming in their lungs. Most of them never woke up. The lucky ones died fast. The unlucky ones lingered long enough to know what was happening. Every second mattered now. Wet clothing pulled heat from the bod faster than cold air alone. That knowledge, drilled into Caleb during years of frontier survival, drove his hands to move with clinical precision. He removed her frozen shoes first. They came away heavy with ice water. Then her soaked habit and undergarments. Nothing existed in that moment except the desperate arithmetic of survival. Body heat escaping, core temperature falling. Minutes remaining before her organs began shutting down one by one. Dry clothes emerged from a wooden trunk at the foot of her bed. Simple wool dress, stockings, a shawl. He dressed her with careful efficiency, handling her like something precious and fragile that might shatter at rough touch. Outside, he could hear the oldest girl building a fire according to his barked instructions. Smart child. She knew to start with tinder, dry grass, and wood shavings, then kindling arranged in a careful pyramid, then larger pieces of split pine. The flints sparked. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the first small flame caught hold and began to grow. 3 wool blankets came next, wrapped tight around Sister Mary's body to trap whatever warmth still flickered inside. Caleb carried her to the main room and positioned her near the growing fire, close enough for heat, but not so close the flames might catch fabric. As firelight spread across the room, illuminating what the darkness had hidden, Caleb noticed something that turned his blood to ice water. A dark bruise covered her left cheekbone, fresh purple-black against her tanned skin. Her lower lip was split, encrusted with dried blood. A second bruise marked her jaw near the ear, and defensive wounds striped both forearms where she had tried to protect herself. These were not injuries from falling in the snow. Someone had beaten this woman. Someone had left her to die in that storm. Anger flared in his chest, hot and sudden. The old Caleb's voice came hard through the telling. Beating a woman is lower than snake, but beating a woman of God, beating someone who had dedicated her life to caring for orphans, that's the kind of evil that makes a man question whether the devil walks the earth. But Caleb forced the rage down. Emotion would not help her survive the next few hours. Only action mattered now. He pulled a wooden chair close to her bedside and settled in for a long night. The oldest girl, who said her name was Emma, helped him prepare warm water. Not hot, which could shock a frozen system, but lukewarm. He fed Sister Mary small sips whenever consciousness flickered behind her eyelids, tilting her head gently, making sure she swallowed instead of choking. He kept the fire burning strong, adding logs every hour, watching shadows dance across the walls like restless spirits. Outside, wind howled against the cabin walls, like something hungry trying to claw its way inside. Caleb counted her breaths the way he had once counted heartbeats while holding his dying brother in that Abilene saloon. 43 breaths per minute at first. Too fast. Her body fighting desperately against the cold. Then 40, then 35. Slowly returning to normal as warmth crept back into her bones. Emma sat with the younger children, keeping them calm, rationing out the last of their food. Stale bread and dried apples. Not much, but enough to quiet growling bellies until morning. What happened? Caleb asked the girl. Emma's voice came small but steady, a child forced to grow up too fast by circumstance. 3 nights ago, bad men came. They wanted Sister Mary to sign papers. She said no. They hit her. She went to town the next day to get help from the sheriff, but he wouldn't come. She rode back in the storm and came through that door frozen half to death. We dragged her inside, but the wood was wet and were too small to work the flint right. Who were these men? The one in the black coat called himself Mr. Harlan. Caleb filed that name away for later consideration. For now, his entire focus remained on the woman struggling to breathe beneath 3 layers of blankets. The night stretched endless and dark. Caleb did not sleep. He sat in that chair with his eyes fixed on her face, willing her to keep breathing, refusing to let death claim another person while he watched helplessly. Technical details from his cavalry training ran through his mind like a drill sergeant's litany. Wood consumption rate at 15 degrees below 01 log every 45 minutes to maintain adequate heat. Body heat recovery timeline for severe hypothermia, 6 to 8 hours a minimum. Signs of frostbite to watch for blackening of extremities, blistering, loss of sensation. He checked her fingers and toes. No blackening. She had been lucky in that regard, if anything about this situation could be called lucky. Dawn arrived as pale light creeping through the frost-covered windows. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. Caleb added fresh wood and watched the flames climb again, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. Sister Mary Catherine's eyes opened. Brown and deep as mountain earth after spring rain, those eyes carried an intelligence that even near death had not dimmed. Confusion filled them at first, her mind struggling to assemble fragments of memory into something coherent. She saw the dry dress covering her body, understood that someone had changed her clothes, that someone had saved her life. Her gaze found Caleb sitting beside the bed, this bearded stranger who had stayed through the night. She tried to speak. Her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper scraping against a raw throat. Who are you, Caleb Thorne? Your neighbor from the North Ridge. Her eyes moved to the children, sleeping safely in the main room, then returned to his face. No shame colored her expression at waking in different clothes, no accusation that he had violated her modesty. Only the quiet understanding of someone who recognized that survival sometimes required setting propriety aside. You stayed through the night, she said. Caleb answered with a single nod. Thank you. He did not acknowledge her gratitude. Gratitude was not what he wanted or needed. Instead, he asked the question that had burned through his mind during those long, dark hours. Who did this to you? Sister Mary closed her eyes. When they opened again, something harder than fear had replaced the confusion. Something that looked like cold, patient rage, carefully banked, but ready to ignite. "The men who want this land," she said, "they will come back." Caleb rose from his chair and walked to the window. Snow blanketed the valley in pristine, white, beautiful, and treacherous hiding, whatever darkness moved beneath its surface. Somewhere out there, men who beat women and left them to freeze were planning their next visit. Somewhere out there, evil wore expensive coats and carried legal documents demanding signatures at gunpoint. His fingers brushed the worn grip of his Colt, 6 rounds waiting patient as sleeping wolves. He had spent 4 years running from violence, running from consequences, running from the wanted posters that followed him across state lines. Perhaps the time had come to stop running. Perhaps the time had come to make a stand for something other than his own survival. The old man's voice, speaking 70 years later to his grandson bound for Korea, carried a truth earned through fire and blood. That moment, standing at that window, I made a choice. Not because I was brave, not because I was noble, but because I was tired of running. Tired of letting good people suffer while evil men prospered. Tired of arriving 5 minutes too late. 3 days passed while Caleb remained at the orphanage. He fell into routines that felt strangely natural despite the circumstances, as if some part of him had been waiting for purpose to find him again. Each morning he broke ice from the water trough so the 3 surviving goats could drink. Poor creatures, thin enough to count their ribs through matted fur. One limped badly from an old injury that had never healed right. The fence surrounding the property had been torn down deliberately, not storm damage. Human hands had ripped those posts from the frozen ground with malicious intent, sending a message as clear as shouted threats. Caleb repaired it anyway, driving new stakes into earth that resisted every blow of his hammer. He chopped wood until his shoulders burned, hauled water from the creek through knee-deep snow, kept the fire burning day and night, until warmth finally settled into the cabin, like a welcome guest taking up permanent residence. Sister Mary recovered faster than he expected. Stubborn strength lived in her bones, inherited perhaps from the Apache mother she had lost at age 12. By the second day, she insisted on standing, despite his warnings that she needed rest. By the third, she moved through the cabin, with careful determination, refusing to surrender tasks she considered her own responsibility. Caleb found himself respecting that quiet resilience more than he wanted to admit. Respect was dangerous. Respect led to caring. Caring led to getting involved. And getting involved had put a $500 price on his head. But he stayed anyway. On the third evening, they sat across from each other, while firelight painted the walls in shades of amber and gold. Outside, wind screamed against the cabin like a wounded animal seeking shelter it would never find. "You have no obligation to stay," Sister Mary said quietly. "I know. Then why remain?" Caleb watched flames consume the logs he had split that afternoon. Truth pressed against his chest like a stone. "Because I have watched too many people die alone." She studied him with those dark eyes that seemed to see past the surface of things, past the beard and the scars and the gun on his hip, down to whatever remained of the man he had been before Kansas. Questions lived in her gaze, but she held them back, not yet ready to ask, not yet certain she wanted answers. Instead, she told him about her father. Thomas Hartley had worked as a blacksmith in the nearby town of Stevensville. Strong hands that shaped metal into useful things. Kind heart that never turned away anyone needing help. He had married a woman from the Apache Nation, scandalizing the white community, but not caring what they thought. Together, they bought this land, built this cabin with their own sweat-raised goats from kids barely bigger than barn cats. Thomas's wife died, giving birth to their second daughter, Sarah. Thomas raised both girls alone, teaching them to read and write and shoot, preparing them for a world that would judge them harshly for having Apache blood. Life was hard, but honest. Every sunrise felt like a gift earned through work and sacrifice. Then the railroad came looking for a route through the valley. Northern Pacific sent a man named Cyrus Harlan to acquire the necessary land. He carried contracts in one hand and threats in the other. Most property owners signed away their claims because the money seemed generous or because the alternative seemed worse. Thomas refused to sell. This land was for God's work. These orphans needed a home. No amount of money could change that. 2 weeks after his refusal, Eli Harlan appeared at the town saloon. Cyrus's younger brother, 26 years old, with cold gray eyes and hands that moved like striking snakes. Folks whispered he was the fastest gun in Montana territory, though nobody wanted to test that claim firsthand. Eli accused Thomas of stealing one of his horses, a lie so transparent that everyone in the saloon recognized it immediately. Thomas Blackwood had never stolen anything in his life. He shaped metal for honest wages. He did not take what belonged to others. But the accusation did not matter. Eli wanted a duel. Thomas owned a pistol for dealing with snakes and wolves. He had never pointed it at another human being. When he reached for that weapon in the saloon, his hand moved with the hesitation of a man who still believed in mercy and fair play. Eli's bullet found his heart before Thomas's fingers touched the grip. Sister Mary's voice remained flat as she finished the story. No tears dampened her cheeks. She had cried oceans during the 14 months since that night. Now only dry rage remained hard and cold as winter stone. Everyone knows Eli murdered him, she said. No one will testify against the Harlans. Cyrus controls too many people in this valley. The sheriff, the judge, half the merchants. Fear or money, it doesn't matter which. The result is the same. Justice died with my father. After Thomas's death, his older daughter Catherine had been 27 years old with no husband, no protection, no future except what she could carve from circumstances. She took vows with the Sisters of Charity, became Sister Mary Catherine, and stayed to continue her father's work. The church provided some measure of safety. Even men like Cyrus Harlan hesitated before attacking a nun, but only hesitated. 2 months ago, Cyrus had returned with a new offer, $800 for the property, triple market value. Sign the papers, relocate the orphans, start fresh elsewhere. Sister Mary refused. She had taken vows of poverty. She could not sell church property even if she wanted to, and she did not want to. This land held her father's bones, her mother's memory, the only home these 12 children had ever known. The beating had happened 3 nights ago. Cyrus's men delivering a message about what happened to people who refused reasonable offers. Silence reclaimed the room when her story ended. Firelight flickered. Wind howled. The children slept safely for the first time in days, bellies full of the elk meat Caleb had brought from his own winter stores. Finally, Caleb spoke. I recognize that trick. Sister Mary waited. The story of Abilene had never passed his lips since the night it happened. Some wounds healed better when left unexposed. Some secrets grew roots so deep that pulling them out threatened to destroy everything built above. But sitting here with this woman who had lost everything the same way he had, the words found their own path to freedom. Danny Cade had been 19 when he died. Caleb's younger brother. Quick smile and quicker mind. Future bright as polished silver. He had worked their family farm in Kansas while Caleb rode with the cavalry, sending letters filled with plans and dreams that would never come true. A wealthy rancher decided he wanted that farm, wanted the water rights, wanted the grazing land, wanted everything the Cade family had built through generations of honest labor. One night in Abilene, Danny sat in a saloon drinking coffee and waiting to buy tobacco for their father's pipe. He did not play cards, did not drink whiskey, just wanted tobacco and a few minutes away from farm chores. A hired gun accused him of cheating at a poker game he was not playing. When Danny denied the accusation, the gunman demanded satisfaction, called him a liar and coward in front of the crowded room. Danny drew his pistol because pride demanded a response, because walking away felt like surrender, because he did not understand that some men made their living ending lives and had no more emotion about killing than a butcher slaughtering hogs. Caleb arrived 5 minutes too late. He found his brother bleeding out on the sawdust floor, eyes already glazing over, hands still reaching for a weapon that had done him no good. He held Danny while the light faded, felt the last breath leave his body, watched death steal someone he had sworn to protect. 1 week later, Caleb found the hired gun outside a brothel at the edge of town. No challenge, no warning, just 3 bullets placed center mass before the man could reach for his weapon. Then he rode to the wealthy rancher's property under cover of darkness, burned the stables, burned the barn, burned everything that would catch flame. Then he ran. Wanted posters followed him across state lines. Murder and arson. $500 for Caleb Thorne, dead or alive. He had been running ever since. I don't regret killing that man, Caleb said, meeting Sister Mary's eyes across the firelight. But I regret running afterward. Should have stayed and fought for the farm. Fought for what belonged to us. He leaned forward in his chair. This time I intend to stay. She held his gaze without flinching. They will try to kill you. Perhaps they will succeed, but I promise this, they will pay a heavy price for trying. Before Sister Mary could respond, Caleb stood and walked to the back room. She followed, curious what had drawn his attention. In a small chamber, barely large enough for a bed, a girl lay beneath quilts that rose and fell with labored breathing. 16 years old, thin as winter saplings, with blonde hair spread across the pillow and skin pale as candle wax. "My sister Sarah," Sister Mary whispered. "My father's second daughter. Different mother, same kind heart." The girl's chest rattled with each breath. A cough shook her frame, and when she turned her head, Caleb saw blood on the cloth she pressed to her lips. "Tuberculosis," Sister Mary said. "Final stage. The doctor in Missoula gave her 6 months. That was 4 months ago." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, blue as mountain lakes in summer. She looked at Caleb without fear, already too familiar with death to find strangers frightening. "This is Mr. Thorne," Sister Mary said gently. "He's helping us." Sarah managed a small smile. "Thank you for staying. Catherine worries less when someone else is here." Her voice came thin as smoke, and speaking those few words exhausted her. Her eyes closed again, and within moments her breathing had settled into the shallow rhythm of sleep. Outside the room, Caleb turned to Sister Mary. "She can't be moved." No, the journey would kill her within days. She needs clean mountain air, needs quiet, needs to be somewhere she feels safe. I can't give her more years, but I can give her a dignified death. I can give her this. Sister Mary's voice cracked for the first time. "And if Cyrus forces me off this land, he takes even that small mercy away." The old man's voice, speaking to his grandson 70 years later, carried the weight of that moment. Right then, standing in that doorway, looking at a 16-year-old girl dying of a disease we had no cure for, I knew I would stay. Not because of obligation, not because of guilt, but because for the first time since Danny died, I saw something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, something worth dying for if it came to that. On the 5th morning, the sound of approaching horses shattered the valley silence. 6 riders emerged from the southern trail, moving with the confidence of men who expected no resistance. Caleb stepped onto the porch, positioning his hand near the colt without making the gesture obvious. Cyrus Harlan rode at the front of the formation, black horse beneath him, expensive leather coat despite the cold. A silver-plated Smith & Wesson Schofield gleamed at his hip, the kind of weapon a man bought to make a statement rather than for practical use. 48 years of cruelty had carved deep lines into his face, and his eyes held the flat calculation of a rattlesnake measuring distance before the strike. 5 gunmen spread behind him in a practice formation. Hard faces, empty stares, professional killers who worked for wages and slept soundly after earning them. Cyrus stopped his horse at the gate but made no move to dismount. Looking down from the saddle was part of the intimidation, a way of establishing dominance before words were ever exchanged. "Caleb Thorne," the name dripped from his lips like venom. "Figured you were rotting in some unmarked grave by now." "Harlan," a thin smile crossed the older man's weathered face. "Still have your wanted poster hanging in my office back in town. Kansas wants you badly. Murder and arson. $500 reward." He tilted his head with mock sympathy. "One telegram to the territorial marshal, and you'll decorate a gallows before spring thaw." Caleb remained motionless, refusing to give Cyrus the satisfaction of a reaction. "State your business," he said. "Came to check on the sister." Cyrus peered toward the cabin. "Where is she hiding?" The door creaked open. Sister Mary stepped out carrying her Winchester rifle with the ease of someone who had handled weapons since childhood. She did not aim at anyone directly, but her stance made clear she knew exactly how to use it. Cyrus's eyes narrowed. "You look healthier than expected. Heard you met with some trouble during that blizzard." "Not trouble." Sister Mary's voice cut the cold air like a blade. "Your men beat me and left me in the snow to die." Cyrus raised both hands in theatrical innocence. "I possessed no knowledge of such events." He produced a folded document from inside his coat. "But I came bearing generous terms. $800 for this property. Triple actual market value. Sign the papers. Relocate elsewhere. Start fresh." This land belongs to God, Sister Mary said. Legal and proper, the church recognizes my stewardship. Cyrus laughed. The sound held no warmth. Law. He gestured at the armed men behind him. Out here, guns make the law. Money makes the law. Nothing else matters. Caleb stepped forward. She gave her answer. You heard it clearly. The amusement drained from Cyrus's face like water from a cracked bucket. You are building your own coffin, Cade. A wanted fugitive protecting a nun and orphans. Who will believe your story when bodies start appearing? He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. But before turning his horse, he added one final piece of information, delivering it with the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed watching others squirm. My brother Eli learned you were here. He finds himself curious about your reputation. Stories claim you were fast during your cavalry days. Cyrus smiled with genuine anticipation. Eli wants to discover if those stories hold any truth. The riders vanished down the trail, leaving hoofprints and settling dust. That night, Caleb saddled his horse and rode into town beneath cold stars that offered light but no warmth. The saloon in Stevensville contained the usual assortment of miners, drifters, and broken men seeking warmth at the bottom of whiskey glasses. Caleb found his target in a shadowed corner booth, nursing rot gut that could strip paint from barnwood. Jedediah Marsh had wandered these mountains for 3 decades, collecting secrets the way other men collected dust. After several drinks loosened his tongue, the old prospector talked. Cyrus Harlan doesn't answer to Northern Pacific, Jedediah said, voice barely above a whisper. That's just the story he tells. The real money, the real power that comes from something else entirely. He leaned closer, breath reeking of cheap whiskey and rotting teeth. Copper veins run beneath this entire valley. Rich deposits worth a fortune. Nobody has mined them because extraction requires capital beyond what locals can gather. But once railroad tracks reach this territory, mining companies will follow with their equipment and their money. The pieces clicked together in Caleb's mind like tumblers falling into place inside a lock. This had never been about railroad routes or rights of way. This was about millions of dollars worth of copper ore buried beneath their feet. Cyrus has been quietly purchasing mineral rights attached to every parcel he acquires, Jedediah continued. Pays families a few hundred for their land, gets them to sign away subsurface rights they don't understand. Then when the mines come, he'll be sitting on a fortune. What about Thomas Hartley? Jedediah shook his head sadly. Everyone knows Eli pulled that trigger. Nobody will swear to it in any courtroom. Cyrus has bought too many consciences around here. Fear or gold doesn't matter which. The result is the same. Caleb left coins on the table and stood to leave. Before he reached the door, Jedediah called out one more piece of information. The orphanage sits on the richest vein in the valley. Geological survey Cyrus commissioned privately showed 50,000 tons of high-grade copper beneath that property. At current prices, that's $10 million, maybe more, and he offered that nun $800 for it. The math staggered Caleb. $800 for $10 million in copper, less than 1/100% of the true value. He rode back toward the orphanage as dawn painted the sky in shades of blood and fire. Sister Mary stood waiting on the porch, Winchester cradled in her arms, dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night spent watching for threats that had not yet materialized. Caleb told her everything. The copper, the mineral rights, the fortune Cyrus was building through murder and manipulation. Your father didn't die over a piece of land, Caleb said. He died because millions of dollars in copper ore lay beneath this ground. He died because greedy men decided his life was worth less than metal in the earth. Fire ignited in Sister Mary's eyes. Not grief, something far more dangerous. The kind of controlled rage that could sustain a person through long campaigns and longer winters. What do we do now? She asked. Caleb looked toward the mountains where morning light burned away the darkness, revealing the valley in all its frozen beauty. Somewhere out there, Cyrus Harlan was planning his next move. Somewhere out there, his brother Eli was preparing to test whether Caleb Thorne lived up to his reputation. The old man's voice speaking to his grandson in 1953 carried the weight of decision. Right then I made my choice. Not because I thought I would win. Not because I believed God was on my side, but because I was tired of running. Tired of letting good people suffer while evil men prospered. Tired of being the man who arrived 5 minutes too late. We have 72 hours before they return, Caleb said, and this time running is not something I plan to do. Sister Mary studied his face for a long moment, reading determination there that matched her own. What do we need? Allies, weapons, and a plan that might keep us alive long enough to win. Smoke rose from the orphanage chimney, steady and warm, a signal visible across the valley that someone lived here. Someone who intended to remain. Someone who had finally found something worth defending. Inside, the 12 orphans stirred from sleep. Emma helped the younger children dress while Sister Mary prepared breakfast from their meager supplies. Caleb stood at the window watching the trail south, waiting for the inevitable return of Cyrus Harlan's violence. But for the first time since Danny died in that Abilene saloon, since Caleb had fled Kansas with blood on his hands and murder in his past, he felt something stirring in his chest that he had thought long dead. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile, too easily crushed. This felt more solid, more permanent. This felt like purpose, like a reason to draw breath beyond simple survival, like a cause worth bleeding for and maybe dying for. In the back room, Sarah coughed wetly, the sound of lungs slowly drowning in fluid they could not expel. Sister Mary went to her, held her hand, whispered comfort that both of them knew was temporary at best. Caleb turned from the window and began making plans. 3 days to prepare. 3 days to find allies. 3 days to build defenses that might let them survive what was coming. The war for Bitterroot Valley had begun. The 6th day dawned cold and clear, the kind of morning that made a man grateful for coffee and a warm fire. Caleb stood in the yard behind the orphanage, studying the terrain, with the practiced eye of a soldier who had learned that preparation saved lives. In his mind, the old man's voice echoed across 70 years. I had learned in the cavalry that you don't wait for the enemy to choose the battlefield. You prepare the ground. You turn every advantage in your favor. You make them fight your fight, not theirs. The work began before full light. First came the trench. 4 feet deep, 40 feet long, positioned behind the orphanage where it offered clear fields of fire toward the southern approach. Caleb dug through frozen earth that resisted the shovel, like iron, each strike sending jarring vibrations up his arms. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cold. His shoulders burned, his hands blistered and bled, but he kept digging. The excavated dirt became berms packed solid to stop pistol rounds up to .45 caliber. A man could lie prone in that trench and fire without exposing himself to return shots. A man could reload behind those berms while bullets cracked overhead. Emma watched him work, bringing water when he needed it, asking questions that showed a mind sharper than most adults possessed. Why there? She asked, pointing at the trench placement. Crossfire. Caleb gestured toward the orphanage windows. Someone fires from the building. Someone fires from here. We catch them in between. They can't take cover from both directions at once. What if they get past the trench? Then we fall back to the second position. He pointed to a spot 100 yards north already marked with stakes. Always have a fallback. Never let them trap you in one place. The girl absorbed this knowledge with frightening intensity, as if she understood that survival might depend on remembering every detail. Next came the sandbags, flour sacks filled with frozen earth positioned beneath both main windows. They would stop pistol fire and maybe rifle rounds if the shooter was far enough away. Caleb stacked them 3 high, creating firing ports that offered protection while maintaining clear sight lines. Heavy timber braced the gate, thick posts driven deep and lashed together with rope that would resist a charging horse. Not forever, but long enough for defenders to kill whoever tried to break through. Sister Mary worked beside him without complaint. She carried water from the creek, hauled wood for the fire, kept the children calm and occupied with lessons and chores that maintained the illusion of normalcy. But Caleb saw how she watched the southern trail, how her hand never strayed far from the Winchester, how tension lived in her shoulders like a permanent resident. On the 7th day, he tested her skills. What distance can you shoot accurately? He asked. Sister Mary's eyes met his without hesitation. My mother's people scouted for General Crook during the Apache campaigns. My father placed a rifle in my hands when I was 10 years old. He said a woman in this territory needed to know how to protect herself because men wouldn't always be there to do it for her. That doesn't answer my question. 200 yards against moving targets. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Most men couldn't make that claim honestly. He gestured toward the fence. Show me. She picked up the Winchester, worked the lever to chamber around, and walked to the firing position he indicated. Caleb placed a flour sack on a fence post, 200 yards distant, a white square barely visible against the snow. Sister Mary settled into a stance that spoke of long practice. Feet shoulder-width apart, left hand supporting the forearm, right hand working the lever with smooth efficiency. She took a breath, let half of it out, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked. The flour sack jumped. She chambered another round, fired again. Another hit, 5 shots total, 4 struck the target. The 5th went wide by perhaps 6 inches, and Sister Mary made a small sound of disgust. Wind estimation was off, she said. Caleb felt something shift in his assessment. This was not a helpless woman who needed protection. This was an ally. This was someone who could hold a position and kill if necessary. "You're not a liability," he said simply. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to carry depths he could not fathom. "I stopped being helpless the night they murdered my father. I decided then that I would never be a victim again, that if men wanted to hurt me or mine, they would pay a price for trying." The old man's voice came soft through the telling. That moment, watching her shoot, seeing the steel in her spine, I realized something. This wasn't just about protecting a nun and some orphans. This was about standing beside someone who refused to bend, refused to break, refused to surrender what mattered. And that kind of strength calls to something deep in a man's soul. But there was no time for such contemplations. They had work to do. Caleb taught her reload speed drills. 15 rounds in 90 seconds, working the lever action mechanism until the rhythm became automatic. Muscle memory that would function even when fear and adrenaline made thinking impossible. He showed her how to clear malfunctions, the quick procedures that could save seconds, when seconds meant the difference between living and dying. They practiced shoot and move tactics. Fire from one position, relocate before return fire could find you, fire from the new position. Never stay static. Never become predictable. Emma watched these drills with fierce attention, memorizing every detail. The younger children played in the snow, unaware or uncaring that the adults were preparing for war. Inside, Sarah lay in her bed, coughing wetly, each breath a struggle against lungs slowly filling with fluid. Sister Mary tended to her between training sessions, spooning broth into her mouth, wiping her face with cool cloths, reading passages from the Bible in a voice that offered comfort, if not cure. "How long?" Caleb asked quietly, standing in the doorway. "Weeks, maybe a month if we're lucky." Sister Mary's voice carried no hope of miracle. "The doctor said her lungs are too damaged. Even if the disease stopped progressing today, the scarring would kill her eventually." "She's in pain." "Yes, but she doesn't complain. She's stronger than I am in many ways." Sarah's eyes opened blue as summer sky despite the shadow of death that hung over her. "I can hear you talking about me like I'm already gone," she said, her voice thin but carrying a hint of humor. "I'm dying, not deaf." Sister Mary managed a smile. "I apologize. That was rude." "It's fine." Sarah coughed, the sound rattling deep in her chest. "I'm not afraid. Mama's waiting for me. And Papa. They'll show me around heaven, tell me where everything is." The simple faith in those words hit Caleb harder than expected. He had lost his own faith somewhere between holding Danny's cooling corpse and burning that rancher's barn. But hearing this 16-year-old girl face death with such calm acceptance made him wonder if perhaps he had thrown away something precious in his rage. "Rest," Sister Mary said gently. "Save your strength." As they left the room, Sarah called out one more time. "Mr. Thorne," he turned back. "Thank you for staying. Catherine worries less when you're here. I think she's been alone too long, carrying too much by herself. It's good she has someone to share the burden now." Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady, and walked back outside where the cold air could hide the wetness in his eyes. The 7th night, and he rode out to recruit allies. The old man's voice carried the weight of that decision. "I knew I couldn't hold off 8 men alone. Sister Mary was skilled, but 2 people against 8 professional guns. Those were suicide odds. I needed help. I needed men who had as much reason to hate Cyrus Harlan as I did." 3 farms lay within 5 miles. 3 families who had sold their land to Cyrus under circumstances that smelled of coercion and threat. Men who now worked as hired hands on property they had cleared and built with their own sweat. The first farm belonged to Willard Pruitt, 43 years old, and a wife named Margaret, and three daughters who watched their father come home each night with defeat written across his shoulders. Caleb found him in the barn repairing harness by lamplight. The work was meticulous, the kind of task a man performed when he needed his hands busy, while his mind chewed on problems too large to solve. Mr. Pruitt. Caleb stepped into the circle of lamplight. Willard looked up, recognition flickering across his weathered face. "You're the one staying at the orphanage. The wanted man." "That's right. Sheriff's been asking about you." "I bet he has. Cyrus probably told him to." Willard set down the harness and stood stretching, muscles cramped from bending. "Why are you here? Because Cyrus Harlan cheated you." Caleb let that statement hang in the air for a moment. "The land you sold him contains copper worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes. He knew about the deposits, kept it hidden while offering you pennies for buried treasure." Anger flickered in Willard's eyes, quickly suppressed, but not before Caleb saw it. Good. Anger could be useful if properly directed. "Everyone knows," Willard said quietly. "Can't prove it, but we all know. Cyrus has the geological surveys locked away somewhere. Has witnesses who'll swear the land was worthless when we sold it. Has judges who'll rule in his favor no matter what evidence we present. Tomorrow morning, he brings 8 guns to finish what his brother started at the orphanage. Sister Mary refuses to sign. 12 orphans will die if Cyrus wins." Willard's jaw tightened. "That's a damn shame. But I got a family to think about. Can't help you." Before Caleb could respond, Margaret Pruitt stepped into the barn. She had been listening from the house, and her face carried a fury that years of forced submission had not extinguished. "Our daughters asked me why bad men took our farm," she said, voice shaking with suppressed rage. "They ask why their father works for the man who stole from us. And I have no answer that doesn't make me ashamed." She looked at her husband. "You want to leave them that legacy. You want them to remember their father as the man who stood by while children were murdered, while a woman of God was beaten and killed for refusing to surrender what was right." Willard met his wife's gaze, and something passed between them that needed no words. A decision made through shared glances and years of understanding. "What time?" he asked. "Dawn," Caleb said. "I'll be there." The second farm belonged to Amos Tanner, 51 years old widower, one son aged 14, who looked at his father with a mix of love and disappointment that cut deeper than any blade. Caleb found Amos in his barn repairing harness by lantern light in a scene almost identical to the first farm. Perhaps all defeated men performed the same rituals, seeking control over small things because the large things had been stolen from them. "My son watches me bow to Cyrus every day," Amos said before Caleb could speak. "Watches me swallow pride and call that snake sir. Watches me come home with dirt under my nails from working land that should be his inheritance. What kind of man does that make me? The kind who had no choice then, but you have a choice now." Amos laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "One rifle against 8 professional guns. That's suicide, not choice. 3 rifles if Willard comes. 4 with you, plus Sister Mary makes 5. And I promise you I've sent men to hell before. I know the way." Amos shook his head slowly, and Caleb saw fear win out over courage. Saw a man who had been beaten down too many times to believe standing up would make any difference. "I can't," Amos whispered. "I got a boy to raise. If I die tomorrow, what happens to him? Foster homes, orphanage? I can't risk it. I'm sorry." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to shake sense into this broken man, wanted to make him understand that some things mattered more than survival. But he had run from Kansas for the same reasons. He had chosen safety over standing his ground. Who was he to judge? "I understand," he said simply, and left. The old man's voice carried disappointment that had not faded across 70 years. I didn't blame Amos for his fear. Fear was reasonable, but I thought less of him for letting fear rule him completely. There's a difference between being afraid and being a coward. Afraid means you're scared, but you do it anyway. Coward means you let fear make your decisions. The third farm belonged to Henderson Cole, 38 years old bachelor, a man who drank too much and smiled too little and carried grief like a second skin. Caleb found him on his porch working through a bottle of whiskey that was already half empty despite the early hour. "I'll come," Henderson said before Caleb explained anything. "You don't know what I'm asking." "Doesn't matter." Henderson took another pull from the bottle. 3 years ago, Cyrus beat my brother half to death for refusing to sell. My brother died 2 weeks later from internal bleeding. I did nothing. Watched them bury him. Watched Cyrus walk free. Watched justice die right alongside my brother. He set down the bottle and met Caleb's eyes. I've been waiting for someone to start a fight I could finish. I'll be there at dawn. The old man's voice came soft through the story. Henderson Cole was already dead inside, had been since he watched his brother die. He wasn't coming to fight for the orphans or for Sister Mary. He was coming to die, and maybe in dying to find some kind of redemption for the cowardice that had haunted him for 3 years. When Caleb returned to the orphanage, Sister Mary was waiting on the porch despite the late hour and the bitter cold. "How many?" she asked. "2 for certain, maybe a third if Amos finds his spine." She nodded slowly, calculating odds that did not inspire confidence. 3 against 8. 4 with me. Those are the numbers. We'll need luck. We'll need more than luck. Caleb climbed the steps and stood beside her. We'll need them to make mistakes. We'll need to pick our ground and force them to fight on our terms. And we'll need every advantage we can manufacture. She was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkness where threats waited. "There's something you should know," she said finally, "about Sarah." He waited. "My father took her in when her mother died giving birth. Not his blood, but he raised her like she was. She calls me sister, but really I'm more like a mother to her. Have been since she was 4 years old." "Why tell me this?" "Because if I die tomorrow, she'll have no one. Emma's 14, too young to take responsibility. The younger children will be sent to different homes scattered across the territory. But Sarah," Sister Mary's voice caught, "she's dying anyway. The church will put her in some sanatorium where she'll spend her last weeks surrounded by strangers coughing up her lungs alone." She turned to face him. "If I fall tomorrow, promise me you'll stay. Promise me you'll let her die here in her own bed, looking at the mountains she loves. Promise me she won't die alone." The old man's voice carried the weight of promises made and kept. And right then I made a vow that changed everything. Because promising to stay for a dying girl meant promising to stay after she was gone. Meant promising to stand for this place, these people, this small corner of the world that needed someone to give a damn. "You won't fall," Caleb said. "I'll make sure of it. But if somehow you do, I swear on my brother's grave, Sarah won't die alone. She'll have me, and the children will stay together." Sister Mary reached out and took his hand. Not a romantic gesture, not an invitation. Just a moment of connection between two people who understood that tomorrow might be their last day breathing. They stood there, hands clasped, until the first hint of dawn touched the eastern mountains. Then they went inside to prepare for war. The 8th day arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every detail sharp and painful. No clouds softened the pale sky. No wind disturbed the perfect stillness. The valley waited in breathless anticipation of violence. Caleb positioned himself in the attic Winchester, loaded and ready. From here, he had clear sight lines to the southern approach elevation advantage and the ability to cover both the trench position and the front gate. Sister Mary took her position in the root cellar beneath the orphanage firing port, giving her a protected angle on anyone who made it past the initial defenses. The children huddled behind her, Emma holding the youngest ones, whispering comfort, while fear made her voice shake. Willard Pruitt arrived as promised, riding up from the south with his Sharps buffalo gun and a face carved from granite. He took position behind the woodpile, the heavy rifle capable of dropping a man at 400 yards if the shooter knew his business. And Willard knew his business. Henderson Cole came from the east, reeking of whiskey, but steady on his feet. He positioned himself in the chapel stone walls, offering the best protection available. His Spencer repeating rifle held 7 rounds Civil War surplus that had sent countless men to early graves. They waited. The children tried to be quiet, but fear made them whimper. Emma sang to them softly old hymns their father had taught them, songs about green pastures and still waters and valleys of shadow where no evil could touch the righteous. Sarah lay in her room, coughing wetly, each breath a struggle. She had insisted on being told what was happening, had listened to the explanation with calm acceptance, and then asked only that someone leave her window open so she could see the mountains one last time. "Beautiful morning to Henderson muttered from his position in the chapel. "Nobody's dying today except them," Willard growled back. But Caleb heard the uncertainty in both voices. heard men trying to convince themselves of victory when defeat seemed more likely. The old man's voice came quiet through the memory. Waiting for violence is worse than violence itself. Your mind runs wild with possibilities. Your hands shake. Your mouth goes dry and every sound becomes a threat. Every shadow becomes an enemy. Time stretches like taffy until you think you'll scream from the tension. Then they came. 8 riders appeared on the southern trail exactly as Cyrus had promised. They rode in formation, spread in a skirmish line that spoke of military training. No rushing, no shouting, just the steady advance of professionals who knew their business. Cyrus Harlan rode center black coat stark against the snow, that silver-plated Schofield gleaming in the morning sun. His brother Eli rode at his right hand, young and hungry, eager for the reputation another killing would bring. 6 professional gunmen filled out the formation. 2 wore Confederate gray dusters, cavalrymen who had survived one war and made their living from the skills it had taught. One had a scar across his throat where someone had tried and failed to kill him. The others carried themselves with the empty confidence of men who had killed before and expected to kill again. They stopped 100 yards from the gate. "Sister Mary Catherine," Cyrus's voice carried across the frozen ground. "Last chance, sign the papers, take $1,000, and walk away." "You have 1 minute," silence answered him. Cyrus turned to his brother. "Burn it." Eli Harlan dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man who had never lost a fight. He walked forward slowly, hand hovering near the Colt Lightning on his hip, stopping 50 yards from the gate. "Caleb Thorne," his voice rang out like a challenge. "Face me like a man, or die like a coward, hiding in shadows." The old man's voice carried grim satisfaction. And that's when Sister Mary did something I never expected, something that changed everything. The orphanage door opened, but instead of Caleb, Sister Mary stepped out. She wore no habit, just a simple dress that allowed freedom of movement. Her hair hung loose for the first time since taking her vows, dark as midnight, framing a face that carried determination carved from years of grief. She held her father's Remington revolver in her right hand. "Eli Harlan," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that must have been screaming through her veins. Eli turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Sister, where's your champion?" "I don't need a champion to face my father's murderer." She walked forward until she stood in the center of the yard, 20 paces from Eli Harlan, close enough to see the cruel amusement spreading across his face. "You want a duel?" Her voice carried across the stillness. "I'll give you one. Your Colt against my father's Remington. Quick draw, just like you forced on him." Eli laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "A nun wants to draw against me, sister. I've killed 7 men. You're not even the 8th challenge I've had this month." "My father was no challenge either, just a blacksmith defending his honor. But you shot him anyway." She took another step forward. "Now face someone who knows what you are." In the attic, Caleb had his shot lined up. Easy kill from 80 yards. One squeeze of the trigger, and Eli Harlan would drop like a puppet with cut strings. But the old man's voice came harsh through the memory. "If I shot him, then I stole her moment. I stole her justice. I stole her father's revenge. And I couldn't do that. So I kept my finger on the trigger, ready, praying she was faster than Thomas had been." Eli's hand moved impossibly fast, the kind of speed that came from thousands of hours of practice and dozens of kills. His Colt Lightning cleared leather, rising towards Sister Mary's chest hammer, cocking in one fluid motion. But Sister Mary was faster, not faster than Eli's draw. She couldn't be. He was a professional killer at the peak of his skills. But she cheated. She had already drawn her father's Remington, while it was still hidden in her coat pocket, had it aimed and ready, before Eli ever reached for his weapon. She fired through the fabric. The boom echoed across the valley like judgment delivered from heaven. Eli's shot went wild, his aim thrown off by the bullet that punched through his chest. He staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stain with an expression of profound confusion. "You cheated," he whispered. "I learned from you," Sister Mary said coldly. Eli Harlan collapsed into the snow and did not move again. For one eternal heartbeat, silence held the valley in suspended animation. Then Cyrus screamed, "Kill them all." 7 guns erupted into thunder. Caleb's Winchester cracked from the attic. A Confederate cavalryman pitched backward off his horse, red mist where his head had been. Caleb worked the lever, chambered another round, fired again. The bounty hunter with the scarred throat grabbed his shoulder and howled. Sister Mary dove for cover behind the water trough as bullets tore splinters from the wood. She rolled came up, firing her Winchester now in hand. Three riders wheeled toward her position. Her first shot took a horse in the chest. The animal went down screaming, pinning its rider beneath half a ton of dying flesh. Her second shot caught another gunman in the leg. He fell from the saddle, hitting the frozen ground hard enough to knock him senseless. Her third shot went wide as adrenaline made her hands shake. Willard Sharp's buffalo gun roared like artillery. The massive 45-70 round hit the second Confederate cavalryman square in the torso. The impact literally tore the man in half upper body, separating from lower in a spray of red that painted the snow like some obscene flower blooming. Henderson fired 3 rapid shots from his Spencer, the old Civil War rifle still deadly after all these years. One round caught a gunman in the arm. The other 2 missed, burying themselves in snow and frozen earth. In 90 seconds of violence, the mathematics of the fight had shifted dramatically. 2 attackers dead, 3 wounded, and out of the fight, 2 still mounted and extremely dangerous. But Caleb knew the real threat was yet to come. Professional killers didn't panic. They adapted. One of the remaining gunmen, a former Union sharpshooter who had made his living with precision and patience, dismounted and used his horse for cover. He began firing carefully aimed shots at the attic window, forcing Caleb to keep his head down. Every time Caleb showed himself to take a shot, a bullet cracked past close enough to feel the wind of its passage. The sharpshooter was good, maybe as good as Caleb himself. This was a duel between equals, and only one would walk away. The second remaining gunman, a hired killer from the Butte mining camps, circled wide toward the eastern wall of the orphanage. He found the kitchen door and kicked it in with brutal efficiency. Inside, Sister Mary was reloading when he burst through. She swung her Winchester like a club, the stock connecting with his jaw hard enough to crack bone. But he tackled her anyway, both of them going down in a tangle of limbs and desperation. His Colt Navy revolver swung toward her head. She grabbed his wrist, trying to force the weapon away, but he was stronger and had leverage. The gun barrel inched closer to her face. Then Emma appeared from the root cellar, Thomas Hartley's spare pistol clutched in her 14-year-old hands. The weapon looked enormous, a Remington 44 that probably weighed as much as both her arms together. She aimed with shaking hands and fired. The recoil nearly knocked her down. The bullet hit the gunman in the back, punching between his shoulder blades and out through his chest in a fountain of red. He turned toward Emma, rage and pain twisting his features. Sister Mary grabbed his knife from his belt and drove it upward into his kidney with all the strength desperation provided. The gunman collapsed on top of her dead weight, pinning her to the floor. Emma stood frozen, the pistol dangling from her hand, staring at the man she had just killed. Her face had gone pale as fresh snow. "Emma!" Sister Mary gasped, struggling out from under the corpse. "Emma, look at me!" The girl's eyes found her sister figure, and Sister Mary saw the exact moment when childhood ended forever. "You saved my life," Sister Mary said gently. "You protected our family. That's not murder. That's love." Outside, Willard saw the Union sharpshooter pinning Caleb down and made a decision. He left the cover of the woodpile, exposing himself completely, running 15 yards to get a flanking angle. The sharpshooter saw him, turned. Both men fired simultaneously. Willard's sharps took the sharpshooter in the chest, the massive round doing what massive rounds do to human bodies. The sharpshooter's rifle bullet hit Willard in the throat, severing his carotid artery in a spray of arterial blood. Willard fell to his knees, hands clutching his throat in a futile attempt to stop the fountain of red. He tried to speak, but only bubbles of blood emerged. His eyes found Henderson running toward him from the chapel. "Tell Margaret," Willard managed to whisper through the blood. "Tell her I fought." Then he pitched forward into the snow and was still. The old man's voice came heavy with grief. "Willard Pruitt died so I could live. Took a bullet meant for me, and I never forgot that debt. Never forgot what he gave up so a wanted fugitive could have another day breathing." 7 attackers down, only Cyrus remained wounded in the shoulder where Henderson had managed to clip him before running to Willard's aid. Cyrus scrambled on foot toward the tree line, firing his Schofield blindly behind him, covering his retreat with desperation rather than accuracy. Caleb descended from the attic at a run. He crossed the yard in long strides, peacemaker in hand, tracking Cyrus's fleeing form. He caught up to the older man at the edge of the trees, kicked the Schofield from his hand, stood over him with the peacemaker aimed at his head. "It's over," Caleb said. Cyrus spat blood in defiance. You killed my brother. Your brother murdered innocent men for profit. You'll answer for Thomas Hartley, for Willard Pruitt, for every family you destroyed." Then a rifle shot cracked from the ridge 300 yards distant. The bullet struck dirt near Caleb's boot. Everyone froze. On the ridge barely visible against the tree line, Amos Tanner sat on horseback with a rifle aimed down at the orphanage. "Let Mr. Harlan go, Thorne," his voice carried across the distance, "or I put the next one through your skull." The old man's voice turned bitter. And that's when I learned that Amos's fear had turned him into something worse than a coward. It had turned him into a traitor. Sister Mary emerged from the orphanage, blood on her dress, Winchester in her hands. "Amos, you coward, we fought for your land too." "My son needs a father," Amos shouted back. "I won't die for someone else's fight." A standoff. Caleb's gun on Cyrus, Amos's rifle on Caleb. Sister Mary's Winchester on Amos, but 300 yards was beyond her proven range. Cyrus smiled through the pain. "Seems you lose, Thorne. Drop the gun, or Amos kills you." Sister Mary raised her Winchester. Caleb saw her hands trembling, saw the doubt in her eyes. 300 yards. Wind from the west. Uphill shot. Wounded shoulder affecting her aim. Impossible odds. She closed her eyes. The old man's voice came soft. "I watched her standing there, and I thought we'd lost. Thought Cyrus would walk away and come back with more men. Thought all the blood and death had been for nothing." Sister Mary opened her eyes and fired. The bullet arced across the valley, climbing falling subject to forces of wind and gravity that no human could perfectly calculate. It struck Amos's horse in the hindquarters. The animal reared in pain and surprise. Amos, already nervous, lost his seat and tumbled from the saddle. His rifle went flying. He hit the ground hard, scrambled to his feet, and ran into the trees without looking back. Cyrus's hope died in that moment. Henderson Cole appeared breathing hard blood on his hands from trying to save Willard. "I'm Justice of the Peace for Bitterroot District," he said. "Appointed 3 years ago, never used the authority because Cyrus owned the sheriff." He looked down at Cyrus. "But I witnessed clear self-defense here today. You're charged with conspiracy to commit murder fraud regarding mineral rights assault on a nun and endangering children." They bound Cyrus with rope and loaded him onto a horse. Henderson would take him to Fort Shaw to military justice that Cyrus's money couldn't corrupt. As they prepared to leave, Cyrus looked at Caleb. "This isn't over. I have friends, powerful friends. You're still a wanted man, Thorne." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but you'll hang before they find me." Henderson rode south with his prisoner, and Caleb watched them disappear down the trail. Then he turned to face the aftermath. The old man's voice carried the weight of violence's true cost. "Battles end fast. Cleaning up after them takes forever." Emma sat on the porch steps staring at her hands. Sister Mary sat beside her, one arm around the girl's shoulders. "I killed a man," Emma whispered. "I'm 14 years old and I killed a man." "You saved my life," Sister Mary said. "You protected our family. That's not something to be ashamed of. But I can see his face. When I close my eyes, I can see him looking at me. Will that ever go away?" Sister Mary pulled her closer. "I don't know, but I promise you won't carry it alone." Caleb approached quietly. "I've killed men, Emma. It haunts you. The faces stay with you, but you learn to carry it, and I promise you won't carry it alone either." The girl looked up at him with eyes that had aged a decade in a single morning. "Does it get easier?" "No," he said honestly, "but you get stronger." They buried Willard Pruitt on a small hill behind the orphanage beneath a cedar tree that had stood for 100 years and would stand for 100 more. Caleb dug the grave, 4 hours of hard labor through frozen earth that resisted every strike of the shovel. The children gathered wildflowers, frozen and dead but beautiful in their own way. Sister Mary led the service, no formal priest available, but her words carrying weight nonetheless. Willard Pruitt was a farmer who became a warrior, a father who showed his daughters what courage looks like. He died defending innocence. Heaven's gates stand open for men like him. Emma carved a wooden cross from orphanage timber, burned the inscription with a hot poker. Willard Pruitt, he fought for what was right. Later, Caleb would ride to Willard's farm and tell Margaret what happened. Would give her husband Sharp's rifle, the family heirloom he had carried into battle. Would give her $500 in gold from Cyrus's confiscated money. would tell her that her husband died a hero and her daughter should be proud. But that could wait until the dead were properly buried. 3 weeks passed. Snow melted from fence lines. Brown earth emerged like a promise. Temperature reached 40 degrees warmth, forgotten during the winter, that felt like it would never end. The creek ran with snowmelt, and the first green shoots pushed through soil still frozen beneath the surface. News arrived from Fort Shaw with Henderson's return. Cyrus awaited trial in military prison. The copper survey maps had been entered as evidence. Territorial prosecutors were building a case that might return land to the 14 families Cyrus had defrauded. And Amos, Sister Mary asked. Gone, Henderson said. Fled the territory. His son was taken in by neighbors. There's a warrant for conspiracy, but I doubt they'll find him. Northern Pacific Railroad issued a statement withdrawing from Bitterroot Valley. Too much controversy, they claimed. Too much blood. The truth was simpler. Bad publicity and legal complications made the project unprofitable. The copper remained beneath the earth, unmined and waiting. Caleb spent the 3 weeks repairing the orphanage. Bullet-damaged boards replaced. Kitchen door rebuilt with stronger hinges. Roof patched where a stray round had penetrated. The scars in the wood remained permanent reminders of the day violence came calling. But the community changed too. Farmers brought supplies, grateful that their land might be returned. Women from the church brought food and offers of help. Sister Mary was no longer shunned. She had killed a man in defense of children, and even the most judgmental found it hard to condemn that. Inside, Sarah grew weaker. 5 months into her terminal diagnosis, the tuberculosis was winning its slow war. She coughed more frequently each bout, leaving her exhausted. Blood appeared on the cloths she pressed to her mouth, but she remained in her own bed, looking at the mountains through her window, surrounded by people who loved her. Caleb sat with her, sometimes reading from books she enjoyed, describing the valley's slow transition from winter to spring. Do you think heaven has mountains? She asked one afternoon. I think heaven has whatever makes you happy, he said. Then there must be mountains. She smiled weakly, and Papa will be there to show me around. One evening, as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, Sister Mary and Caleb sat on the porch in rocking chairs that creaked with each movement. Where will you travel from here? She asked. Caleb thought about 4 years of running, thought about wanted posters and fear, and always looking over his shoulder. Thought about arriving 5 minutes too late to save Danny. I've been running long enough, he said. Time to stop. Sister Mary studied his face. This land needs working. Spring brings plowing and planting, more labor than one person can manage. Your father built something worth protecting here. Letting it fall apart seems wrong. She met his eyes. Then stay. Not a question, a simple statement, offered and accepted. They both understood what remained unspoken. He would sleep in the barn propriety maintained. She was a former nun still bound by vows, even if those vows were invalid. He was a wanted man with a price on his head. Romance was impossible, impractical, dangerous. But partnership was possible. Mutual respect, shared purpose. Something neither of them would name, but both felt growing between them like spring shoots pushing through frozen earth. For Sarah, he said, and the children. For all of us, she replied. 1 week later, 3 riders approached from the south. They moved slowly, deliberately, stopping at the property boundary 200 yards from the orphanage. One dismounted, drove a wooden stake into the ground, nailed a paper to it, and remounted. Then all 3 rode away without a word. Caleb walked out to investigate. The document was official-looking, printed on expensive paper with a legal seal. He read it with growing dread. Notice of Mineral Rights Claim. San Francisco Copper Consolidated. Hereby asserts ownership of subsurface mineral rights on properties described below, pursuant to revised statutes section 2319. Legal survey scheduled April 15, 1883. Cooperation expected. Resistance will be met with legal action and / or necessary force. Augustus Blackwell, Esquire Chief Representative. Below the printed notice, someone had added a handwritten note in different ink. Thorne, we're coming. 20 men. You can't win this time. Leave now or bury everyone you love. C.H. Cyrus Harlan had gotten free, and he was bringing an army. Sister Mary joined him at the stake, reading the notice over his shoulder. What does it say? Says we have 3 weeks before they come. She read in silence, her face hardening with each line. We beat 8 men. We can beat 20. Not alone we can't. He looked toward the distant town. We'll need allies, real ones this time. Farmers who lost land, miners who have been cheated. We'll need to build an army of our own. Sister Mary's hand moved to her abdomen, a protective gesture, though she carried no child. Just the weight of responsibility for 12 orphans and a dying sister. For Sarah, she said, for all these children. We fight. Smoke rose from the orphanage chimney, steady and warm, a signal across the valley that someone lived here, someone who would not surrender. The old man's voice spoke across 70 years to his grandson, preparing for Korea. I thought the war for Bitterroot had ended. I was wrong. It had just begun. Dawn arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every detail painfully sharp. No clouds softened the pale sky. No wind disturbed the perfect stillness. The valley waited in breathless anticipation, the kind of quiet that preceded storms, or violence, or both. Caleb stood alone before the reinforced gate, the peacemaker waiting in its holster. Behind him, Sister Mary held position inside the orphanage, Winchester aimed through the sandbagged window. The children huddled in the root cellar beneath the chapel MOM, with them holding the youngest ones close and whispering prayers their father had taught them. In Sarah's room, the girl lay propped against pillows, insisting her window remain open so she could see the mountains one last time. Her breathing came in wet rattles, each exhale a small surrender to the disease consuming her lungs. Beautiful morning to die, she had said when Caleb checked on her at first light. Nobody's dying today except them, he had replied, though he was not sure he believed it. The old man's voice, speaking 70 years later to his grandson bound for Korea, carried the weight of that morning. When you know violence is coming, when you've prepared as much as humanly possible, all you can do is wait. And waiting is its own kind of torture. Your mind conjures 1,000 different ways to die. Your hands shake no matter how hard you try to steady them. Time stretches like taffy until you think you'll scream from the tension. They came at noon. 8 riders this time, not the 6 Caleb had expected. Cyrus Harlan rode at the center of the formation, black coat stark against the snow, that silver-plated Schofield gleaming in the winter sun. His shoulders still carried bandages from Henderson's bullet weeks earlier, but hatred had given him strength enough to sit a saddle. His brother Eli's body had been buried in an unmarked grave outside Stevensville. No one spoke at his funeral. No one mourned. He had lived by violence and died by it, and the world turned without missing him. But Cyrus had not forgotten. Beside him rode 7 professional killers. Not the amateurs from the first attack, but genuine hardened men. 2 former Pinkerton detectives who had left the agency when their methods became too brutal even for that ruthless organization. A bounty hunter from Colorado with 11 confirmed kills. 4 hired guns from the Butte mining camps, men who murdered for wages and slept soundly afterward. They stopped 100 yards from the gate. Caleb Thorne, Cyrus's voice carried across the frozen ground. I came to make you an offer. Caleb said nothing, waiting. Walk away now and I let you live. Take your horse and ride north into Canada, cross the border, and never come back. I'll even give you $100 for travel expenses. Cyrus smiled, the expression holding no warmth. Or stay and watch everyone you care about die, screaming. Though Caleb remained silent, his hand resting near the peacemaker, watching the formation for weaknesses. No answer. Cyrus's smile widened. Then let me make the choice easier. He gestured to one of his men, who produced a cloth sack and upended it onto the snow. 3 objects tumbled out, and Caleb's blood turned to ice water. Wanted posters, not just his own, but new ones. Fresh ink, clear photographs. Sister Mary Catherine Hartley, wanted for murder of Eli Harlan, $500. Emma Hartley, wanted for murder of Jack Morrison, $250. Henderson Cole, wanted for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment of Cyrus Harlan, $300. I have friends in high places, Cyrus called out. Judges, marshals, territorial governors. They've issued warrants for everyone who stood against me. You walk away, maybe I forget to file them. You stay, and everyone here hangs, including that 14-year-old girl. The old man's voice came hard through the memory. That moment I understood the true nature of evil. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the copper. It was about power, about making people suffer for daring to resist, about crushing anyone who stood up and said no to men like Cyrus Harlan. Caleb took 3 steps forward, clearing the gate standing exposed in the open yard. "You want me?" he called back. "Then come and get me. But you leave the women and children out of this. This is between us, man to man." Cyrus laughed. "There's no us, Thorn. There's just me and the 8 men who are about to kill you. Then we're going to burn that orphanage with everyone inside. Sister Mary will watch her children burn before we hang her. That's the price of defiance." He raised his hand, preparing to signal the charge. Then Sister Mary stepped onto the porch. She held no weapon. She had laid down her Winchester inside. She stood in her simple dress with her hands at her sides, dark hair loose around her shoulders. "Mr. Harlan," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that must have been screaming through her veins. "Before you kill us all, I want you to know something." Cyrus lowered his hand, curious. "What's that, sister?" "My father was a good man. He built this orphanage with his own hands. He took in children nobody wanted. He never hurt anyone, never stole, never lied. He was everything a Christian should be." Her voice grew stronger. "And your brother murdered him for money, shot him down in cold blood while everyone watched. You know this. Everyone in this valley knows this." "Your point." "My point is that God sees, God knows. And no matter how much money you have, no matter how many judges you've bought, no matter how many men you hire to do your killing, you will answer for what you've done. Maybe not today, maybe not in any earthly court, but you will answer." "Ah," Cyrus sneered. "Save your preaching, sister. God's not here, just guns and men willing to use them." "Then I pity you," Sister Mary said simply, "because a man with no fear of judgment is a man with no soul. And that's a kind of death worse than anything you can inflict on us." For just a moment, something flickered in Cyrus's eyes. Not remorse, but perhaps recognition. Recognition that he had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, that he had become something less than human in pursuit of wealth. Then the moment passed and the hardness returned. "Touching speech," he said, "but it changes nothing. Kill them all." The 8 riders charged. Caleb's Winchester cracked from where he stood exposed in the yard. A Pinkerton detective fell from his horse head, snapping back. Caleb worked the lever, fired again. The bounty hunter grabbed his chest and tumbled backward into the snow. But 6 remained, and they were spreading out, flanking, using the tactics of men who had done this before. Sister Mary's Winchester roared from the orphanage window. A hired gun's horse went down, pinning the rider. She fired again, catching another gunman in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. 4 left now, but they had reached the gate. Timber splintered under the impact of charging horses. The barricade held for 3 seconds, then gave way in an explosion of breaking wood. Caleb dove behind the water trough as bullets tore through the air where he had been standing. He came up firing, dropping the lead rider with a shot through the throat. 3 left. Henderson Cole burst from the chapel, Spencer rifle spitting fire. His first shot took a hired gun in the side. His second shot went wide. His third jammed in the chamber. One of the remaining gunmen turned his pistol on Henderson, fired twice. Both bullets struck Henderson in the chest, driving him backward against the chapel wall. He slid down slowly, leaving a red smear on stone, the Spencer falling from nerveless fingers. 2 attackers left, plus Cyrus. But these 2 were the best of the bunch. Former Pinkertons who had survived a dozen range wars and countless gunfights. They split up with practiced efficiency, one circling toward the orphanage, one toward Caleb's position. The one approaching the orphanage kicked in the already damaged kitchen door, found Sister Mary reloading, raised his revolver. Emma appeared from the root cellar, Thomas Hartley's pistol in her hands, for the second time in 3 weeks. The weapon that had killed 1 man already. The weapon that still haunted her dreams. She fired without hesitation. The bullet took the Pinkerton in the back, punching through his lung. He staggered, turned toward this 14-year-old girl who had just shot him, raised his own weapon with shaking hands. Sister Mary grabbed the carving knife from the kitchen table and drove it into his kidney. The Pinkerton collapsed dead before he hit the floor. Outside, Caleb and the last gunman circled each other like wolves, both seeking advantage, both knowing the next shot would likely be the last. The gunman was good, professional, patient. He used his horse for cover firing, carefully aimed shots that forced Caleb to keep moving to stay defensive, unable to get a clear shot in return. The old man's voice came quiet through the telling. I was younger than him, faster than him, but he had experience and patience, and in a gunfight, those advantages often matter more than speed. They traded shots for what felt like hours but was probably less than a minute. Caleb's shoulder burned where a bullet had creased it. The gunman had taken a round through his thigh, but kept fighting using pain as fuel for rage. Then the gunman's horse reared, spooked by the smell of blood and powder smoke. Just for a second, the animal's movement exposed the rider's torso. Caleb took the shot. The peacemaker bucked in his hand. The bullet struck the gunman square in the chest. He toppled from the saddle, hit the ground hard, and did not move again. Silence fell across the orphanage yard. Silence broken only by Emma's sobbing inside the building, by Sarah's wet coughing from her room, by the dying whimpers of wounded horses. 8 attackers down, but Cyrus Harlan remained. He had dismounted during the chaos, had slipped around to the eastern side of the property, moving with the desperate speed of a man who knew his plan had failed. Caleb found him trying to flee into the trees, tackled him from behind. They went down together, grappling in the snow, too close for guns, fighting with fists and desperation. Cyrus was older, but fueled by hate. He got his hands around Caleb's throat, squeezing, cutting off air. Caleb drove his knee into Cyrus's wounded shoulder. The older man screamed and his grip loosened. Caleb scrambled free, gasping, reaching for the peacemaker. But Cyrus grabbed it first, the silver-plated Schofield appearing in his hand like magic. He aimed at Caleb's head from 3 feet away. At that range, even a poor shot couldn't miss. Should have taken my offer, Cyrus rasped. Should have run when you had the chance. His finger tightened on the trigger. A rifle shot cracked across the valley. Cyrus jerked his aim, thrown off the Schofield, discharging into the ground. He looked down at the red spreading across his chest, confusion replacing the hatred in his eyes. On the ridge, 300 yards distant, barely visible against the tree line, a lone figure stood, too far to identify clearly. But Caleb knew. Amos Tanner had come back. The coward had found his courage too late to matter, but in time to save one life. Cyrus fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the snow. His breathing came in wet gurgles, blood bubbling from his mouth. My brother, he whispered. You killed my brother. Your brother was a murderer, Caleb said, and so were you. Cyrus's eyes glazed, his breathing stopped. The man who had terrorized Bitterroot Valley for 3 years was finally permanently gone. Henderson Cole died on the chapel steps while Sister Mary held his hand. He had taken 2 bullets through the chest, and no frontier medicine could fix that kind of damage. Blood filled his lungs with each labored breath. Did we win? He asked, voice barely audible. We won, Sister Mary said gently. Cyrus is dead. They're all dead. The children are safe. Henderson managed a smile. Good. That's good. He coughed, red froth appearing on his lips. My brother can rest now. I can rest. You were brave, she told him. You stood when others ran. You fought for what was right. God will welcome you home. Don't know about God, Henderson whispered. But my brother will be there. That's enough. His hand went slack in hers. His eyes stared at the sky, but saw nothing. Sister Mary closed them gently and said a prayer over his body. They buried Henderson Cole next to Willard Pruitt on the hill behind the orphanage. 2 heroes resting beneath the cedar tree, their wooden crosses standing sentinel over the valley they had died protecting. Emma carved Henderson's marker with shaking hands, still processing the fact that she had killed another man. 2 deaths in 3 weeks. 2 faces that would haunt her dreams. Henderson Cole. He found his courage when it mattered most. Caleb stood at the graveside, hat in hand, while Sister Mary spoke the words of remembrance. The children gathered wildflowers, creating small bouquets that would freeze and die, but still served as symbols of gratitude. We barely knew him, one of the younger children said. Why did he fight for us? Sister Mary knelt beside the boy. Because some men need a cause to die for more than they need a reason to live. Henderson Cole lost his way when his brother died, but in the end he found it again. He found it here, standing with us. News of Cyrus Harlan's death spread through the territory like wildfire. Within a week, the fraudulent wanted posters had been withdrawn. The territorial governor, no longer receiving Cyrus's bribes, launched an investigation into land fraud that would eventually return property to most of the families who had been cheated. The copper remained beneath the earth unmined and waiting. The mining company from San Francisco sent representatives to assess the situation, took one look at the bodies and the blood and the determined faces of people who had fought for their land, and decided Montana Territory was more trouble than it was worth. They sold their mineral rights claims to a group of local investors who promised fair wages and safe working conditions if mining ever began. But that would be years in the future, long after the snow had melted and the valley had healed. Spring came slowly to Bitterroot, as it always did. Snow retreated inch by stubborn inch. Brown earth emerged like a promise kept. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the first green shoots pushed through soil that had been frozen since November. Caleb spent his days repairing the orphanage, replacing boards shattered by bullets, rebuilding the gate, patching the roof. The scars remained in the wood, permanent reminders of violence, but the structure stood solid. Sister Mary planted a garden, teaching the children to prepare soil and sow seeds. Life pushing back against death. Hope growing in ground that had been soaked with blood. But in Sarah's room, the tuberculosis was winning its slow war. 6 months into her terminal diagnosis, the girl could barely lift her head from the pillow. Each breath came with visible effort. Her skin had gone translucent, revealing the blue tracery of veins beneath. Blood appeared more frequently on the cloth she pressed to her mouth. Caleb sat with her, often reading from books she loved, describing the valley's transformation from winter to spring. Sometimes they talked. More often they sat in companionable silence, watching mountains through the window. "Tell me about your brother," Sarah said one afternoon, her voice thin as smoke. Caleb hesitated. He had not spoken of Danny to anyone except Sister Mary, but something in Sarah's eyes, some recognition of shared grief, made the words come easier. Danny was 19 when he died. Quick smile, quicker mind. Wanted to be a teacher, wanted to help kids learn to read and write and think for themselves. Caleb's voice roughened. "Some hired gun murdered him over a lie, and I killed that man in revenge. That's why I ran. That's why I've been hiding for 4 years." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you think Danny would want you to keep running?" "No, he'd want me to stop, to build something instead of destroying things in anger." "Then you should stop." She coughed, the sound wet and painful. When she could speak again, she continued, "You found something here worth building. Don't throw it away because you're afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of caring, afraid of losing people again, afraid that if you let yourself love this place and these people, God might take them away like he took Danny." Sarah's blue eyes held wisdom beyond her 16 years. "But that's not how it works. Love doesn't make loss hurt less. It just makes the time before loss matter more." The old man's voice, speaking to his grandson 70 years later, carried the weight of that lesson. "A dying girl taught me what I needed to learn. That running from loss only meant losing more. That the fear of pain shouldn't prevent you from living. That some things were worth the risk of heartbreak." Sarah died on a Sunday morning in late April, with spring sunlight streaming through her window and the smell of mountain flowers drifting on the breeze. Sister Mary sat on one side of her bed holding her hand. Caleb sat on the other. Emma and the younger children crowded into the doorway, not wanting to intrude, but needing to be close. Sarah's breathing had become so shallow that each exhale seemed like it might be the last. But she opened her eyes one final time, looked at Sister Mary with infinite love, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me die at home." "I love you," Sister Mary said through tears. "I love you so much." "I know." Sarah's gaze moved to Caleb. "Take care of her. She pretends to be strong, but she needs someone." "I will," he promised. Sarah smiled. Her eyes closed. 3 more breaths, each one smaller than the last, and then she was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Not peaceful exactly, but finished. The long struggle was over. The suffering had ended. Sister Mary wept without sound, her shoulders shaking, her hand still holding Sarah's. Emma came to her and put young arms around her sister. Figure crying too, the two of them supporting each other in shared grief. Caleb stepped outside to give them privacy. He walked to the hill where Willard and Henderson rested beneath the cedar tree. Soon Sarah would join them, the third casualty of Cyrus Harlan's greed. He stood there for a long time, looking out over the valley as the sun climbed higher, thinking about death and life and the choices that separated one from the other, thinking about running and standing, thinking about the terrified fugitive who had found a frozen nun and decided to stop being afraid. They buried Sarah the next day on the hill beneath a cedar tree in ground that Caleb dug for the third time in as many weeks. Sister Mary wore her black habit for the funeral the first time she had donned it since the battle. She led the service with a voice that barely trembled. Sarah Hartley was my sister in all the ways that mattered. She faced death with more courage than most people face life. She loved these mountains, loved this valley, loved the children who became her family. And now she rests in the place she loved most, surrounded by heroes who died protecting what she held dear. Emma carved the wooden cross, her hands steadier now, the work giving her purpose. Sarah Hartley, she died at home surrounded by love. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Sister Mary and Caleb sat on the porch in rocking chairs that creaked with each movement. The children played in the yard, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the day's grief. She held on as long as she could, Sister Mary said quietly. Waited until she knew we were safe. Until Cyrus was gone and the threat had passed. Then she let go. She loved you very much. I loved her too. Love her still. Sister Mary wiped at her eyes. The hardest part is knowing I could have done more. Could have taken her to doctors in the East. Could have tried experimental treatments. Could have bankrupted the orphanage and still watched her die, Caleb interrupted gently. Some diseases can't be fought with money or medicine. All you can do is make the time that's left as good as possible. And you did that. You gave her a home and a family and dignity. That was the greatest gift possible. They sat in silence as darkness gathered. One by one, the stars emerged like silver coins scattered across black velvet, the same stars that had watched over this valley for millennia, indifferent to human struggles, beautiful in their permanence. What happens now? Sister Mary asked finally. Caleb considered the question. The wanted poster from Kansas was still technically active. $500 still hung over his head. But with Cyrus dead and his network of corrupt officials dismantled, the chances of anyone tracking Caleb to Montana territory seem remote. I stay, he said, if you'll have me. In what capacity? Whatever capacity you'll allow. Hired hand, partner, friend. He paused. I know you took vows. I know there are rules about former nuns and relationships. I'm not asking for anything except permission to stay and help. Sister Mary turned to face him in the gathering dark. The vows are invalid. I broke them when I refused the Mother Superior's order to abandon this place. I'm not a nun anymore. Just a woman trying to keep 12 orphans alive and honor my father's memory. Then what are you asking? I'm asking if you're staying because you feel obligated or because you want to. The old man's voice speaking to his grandson carried the truth of that moment. And right then I had to make a choice. I could lie, could pretend it was just about duty or protecting the children. Or I could be honest about what had grown between us during the long winter and the violent spring. I'm staying because I want to, Caleb said. Because for the first time since Danny died, I've found something worth protecting. Not just the orphanage or the children. You. I'm staying because I want to see what we could build together if we had the chance. Sister Mary reached across the gap between their rocking chairs and took his hand. Not a romantic gesture exactly, but something deeper. A promise, a beginning. Then stay, she said simply. They sat there as full darkness claimed. The valley hands clasped two people who had survived violence and loss and were choosing hope despite everything that should have made hope impossible. Inside, Emma was reading to the younger children, her voice carrying through the open window. A story about brave knights and rescued princesses, the kind of tale that made children feel safe even when the world was dangerous. In the bedroom where Sarah had died, the window remained open. Sister Mary would close it, eventually would reclaim that space for one of the orphans who needed a room. But not yet. For now it stood as a memorial, letting mountain air flow through in remembrance of the girl who had loved these peaks with her last breath. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady and warm, a signal that someone lived here, someone who intended to stay. But 3 weeks later, in a prison cell at Fort Shaw that should have held Cyrus Harlan, but stood empty, a visitor arrived. The guard unlocked the door to admit Augustus Blackwell, representative of San Francisco Copper Consolidated. Expensive black vest, gold watch chain, manicured hands that had never known hard labor. He looked around the empty cell with mild surprise. "Where's the prisoner?" Dead, the guard said. Killed in a shootout at the orphanage. Whole gang wiped out. Augustus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Calculation, reassessment, the kind of cold math that counted human lives as mere numbers on a balance sheet. Tell me about the man who killed him. The guard shrugged. Name's Caleb Thorne, wanted fugitive from Kansas. But he's got friends now. Half the valley owes him for stopping Cyrus Harlan. And the property, the orphanage, still there, still occupied. None and a dozen orphans, plus Thorne protecting them. Augustus nodded slowly, mind already working through possibilities, assembling strategies, calculating costs and benefits. Thank you for your time. He produced a coin and flipped it to the guard. For your trouble. He walked out of the fort and climbed into his carriage. Inside waited two men in dark suits, Pinkerton detectives hired to handle problems that legal methods couldn't solve. Cyrus Harlan is dead, Augustus said as the carriage began moving. His operation was sloppy, drew too much attention. We'll take a different approach. What approach? One of the detectives asked. Patient, legal. We'll file proper claims with the territorial government. We'll survey the land officially. We'll offer fair market value for the surface rights while retaining subsurface mineral rights. Augustus smiled without warmth. And if they refuse to sell, we'll bring 20 Pinkerton men to persuade them. But we'll do it quietly. No massacres, no public battles, just steady pressure until they break. He pulled out a map of Bitterroot Valley, traced his finger over the orphanage property. 50,000 tons of high-grade copper beneath that land. At current prices, $9 million. Maybe 10. We'll offer them 2,000 for the surface rights. They'll think they're getting a fortune while we extract millions from beneath their feet. The detectives nodded. They had played this game before in Colorado and California and Nevada. Legal theft, they called it. Technically within the law, but morally bankrupt. When do we move? One asked. 3 weeks. Let them relax, let them think they've won. Then we arrive with surveyors and legal documents. If this Caleb Thorne interferes, we'll have him arrested for violating the Fugitive Slave Act. That law doesn't apply anymore. War's been over 20 years. Augustus waved dismissively. There are always laws. We just need to find the right one, and if laws don't work, we have other methods. He looked out the carriage window at the passing landscape, seeing not mountains and trees, but dollar signs and profit margins. San Francisco, copper consolidated, doesn't lose, he said quietly. Cyrus Harlan was an amateur who let emotion cloud his judgment. We're professionals, and professionals always win eventually. The carriage rolled south toward Missoula, carrying men who turned human suffering into quarterly earnings, who saw orphans and nuns and dying girls as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be protected. Back at the orphanage, Caleb stood at the southern boundary driving fence posts into ground that had thawed enough to accept them. Honest work that made his shoulders burn and his hands blister. The kind of work that built things instead of destroying them. Sister Mary worked in the garden, showing the children how to plant potatoes and carrots and beans. Emma helped the youngest ones, her face still carrying shadows from the men she had killed, but her hands steady as she demonstrated proper technique. None of them knew what was coming. None of them suspected that the war for Bitterroot Valley had not ended with Cyrus Harlan's death. The old man's voice speaking in 1953 to his grandson bound for Korea carried the weight of what followed. 3 weeks later they came, 20 Pinkerton detectives, territorial surveyors, lawyers with documents we couldn't understand. And the fight began again. But that's a story for another night. He stood from his chair, bones creaking, and walked to the window. Outside, snow fell across the same valley where he had found a frozen nun 70 years earlier. You asked me if I was scared when I left for Kansas, Caleb said to Ethan. I said yes. Fear is natural. Fear is honest. But let me tell you what I learned. He turned to face his grandson. A man isn't measured by the days he lives. He's measured by what he protects when everything's at stake. You remember that in Korea. Not every battle is worth fighting. But some battles, the ones for people who can't protect themselves, those define your soul. Ethan stood moved by something he couldn't quite name. What happened with the mining company? Did you win? The old man smiled, the expression crinkling a face mapped with lines earned through hard living. We fought for 3 years. Court battles, negotiations, one more armed standoff that almost ended in bloodshed. But eventually we won. The territorial government ruled in our favor. The orphanage kept its land. The children grew up safe. He walked to a shelf and picked up a small wooden horse carved by Timothy decades earlier and preserved through 70 years of changing circumstances. Timothy made this for me before the first battle. Said it was for luck. I've carried it ever since. He handed it to Ethan. Now I'm giving it to you. For Korea. For luck. Ethan took the carved horse, feeling the weight of history in his hands. What happened to Sister Mary, to the orphans? Caleb's smile widened. Sister Mary became my wife in 1886 after the last legal battles were won. We raised those 12 orphans together. Saw them all grow to adulthood. Saw them marry and have children of their own. Your mother was one of those orphans, which makes you living proof that sometimes the good guys win. He moved to a photograph on the wall, black and white image of a younger Caleb standing beside a woman with dark hair and eyes that still carried strength despite the decades. She died in 1948, 62 years we had together. Every day, a gift. His voice roughened with emotion. And it all started because I found a frozen nun and decided to stop running. Ethan stared at the photograph, connecting pieces of family history he had never fully understood. You never went back to Kansas. Never needed to. Governor issued a pardon in 1887 after witnesses came forward about the circumstances of Danny's death. Wanted poster was withdrawn. I was free. Caleb touched the photograph gently. But I was already free the moment I chose to stay and fight instead of running. Outside, wind howled against the cabin walls. Snow continued falling, blanketing the valley in white silence. The same mountains stood sentinel, unchanged by human struggles, beautiful in their permanence. Get some sleep, Caleb said. You ship out in 3 days. You'll need your strength. Ethan clutched the wooden horse and moved toward the guest room. At the doorway, he paused. Thank you, Grandpa, for the story, for the horse, for everything. You're welcome, boy. Now go on. After Ethan left, Caleb stood alone by the window, watching snow fall across the valley where he had spent 70 years of his life, where he had found love and purpose and redemption, where he had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand despite it. He could see the orphanage in his mind's eye, even though it had been converted to a community center decades ago. Could see Sister Mary on the porch Winchester, in her hands facing down 8 gunmen, with nothing but faith and fury. Could see Sarah's window always open to mountain air. Could see the graves beneath the cedar tree where heroes rested. All of it gone now, transformed by time into memory and story. But the lessons remained. The choices mattered. The stand had been worth taking. The old man touched the window glass, felt the cold seeping through, and smiled. I thought the war for Bitterroot had ended when Cyrus died, he whispered to the empty room. I was wrong. But we won anyway. We won because we refused to surrender what mattered, because we stood together, because we believed some things were worth dying for. He returned to his chair and stared into the fire until sleep claimed him, dreams filled with frozen nuns and spring mountains, and the woman he had loved for 6 decades waiting for him in whatever came after this life ended. The fire burned low, snow fell, and in the silence the ghosts of Bitterroot Valley kept their vigil, remembering the winter when a wanted fugitive found something worth protecting and chose to stop running.